The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Sterling sat behind his imposing desk, his gray hair neatly combed and his black robe pressed to perfection. It was 9:15 a.m., and like every Tuesday, the traffic court was bustling with nervous people waiting for their turn. "Next case," Judge Sterling called out, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench. He didn't even look up from his papers as the next person approached the podium. Sarah Mitchell stood straight, her simple blue blazer and black skirt looking professional but unremarkable. At 42 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity, though her fingers nervously played with the traffic citation in her hands. She was running late for an important meeting, and her hope for a quick hearing was starting to fade. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and educated, "I'm here regarding a speeding ticket from—" "I can read the citation, nice." Judge Sterling finally glanced up, his eyes scanning her briefly before looking down at the paperwork. "Mitchell, you were caught doing 45 in a 30 zone near Franklin Elementary School." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, Your Honor, but if I could explain." "Do you deny you were speeding?" Judge Sterling cut her off, his tone carrying the boredom of someone who had heard every excuse in the book. "No, Your Honor, but there were special circumstances. You see, I was—" Judge Sterling held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. The morning sun caught his gold wedding ring as he gestured dismissively. "Miss Mitchell, there are always special circumstances. Everyone who comes before me has a story about why they broke the law. The fact remains. You were speeding in a school zone." The courtroom fell silent. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the court officers, Officer Rodriguez, who had seen thousands of cases like this, noticed something different in Sarah's demeanor. Unlike most defendants, she didn't appear angry or scared, just disappointed. "Your Honor, I understand the seriousness of speeding in a school zone." Sarah tried one more time. "I was actually on my way to a meeting about funding new safety measures for—" "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Sterling interrupted again, his patience visibly wearing thin. He removed his reading glasses and fixed her with a stern look. "The purpose of these fines is to teach responsibility. The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their reasons or excuses." Sarah's shoulders dropped slightly, but she maintained her composure. She noticed how the judge's eyes barely met hers, how his tone carried assumptions she had faced many times before in her life. "The fine is $400, Judge Sterling declared, already reaching for the next case file. "You can pay at the clerk's office, and Miss Mitchell—" He paused, his tone condescending. "I suggest you leave earlier next time. We wouldn't want to endanger any children with our busy schedules, would we?" A few snickers came from the back of the courtroom. Sarah felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from a familiar feeling of being judged before being heard. She had faced this throughout her career, people seeing her skin color first and her capabilities second. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied quietly, her dignity intact. As she turned to leave, she pulled out her phone to check the time. Her meeting at City Hall was in 30 minutes. A meeting where she would be announcing a $5 million grant for local education and safety initiatives, including significant funding for the very courthouse she stood in. Officer Rodriguez watched her leave, noticing how she held her head high despite the judge's dismissive treatment. He had seen countless people walk through these doors, but something about Ms. Mitchell struck him as different. If only Judge Sterling had taken the time to really look at the woman standing before him, he might have seen it too. As Sarah walked out into the bright morning sun, her phone buzzed with messages about the upcoming press conference. She'd had work to do, important work that would impact thousands of lives. This courtroom incident was just another reminder of why her work in community development and social justice was so crucial. Judge Sterling, meanwhile, had already moved on to the next case, unaware that his quick judgments would soon come back to challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, fairness, and the danger of first impressions. Judge Sterling walked into the City Hall meeting room at exactly 6:00 p.m., straightening his tie as he found a seat near the back. These monthly community development meetings were mandatory for city officials, but he usually spent them checking emails on his phone. Tonight, though, something felt different in the air. The room was unusually full, with news cameras set up in the corners. "What's all the fuss about?" he asked Jerry Thompson, another judge who sat next to him. You haven't heard? Jerry raised his eyebrows. Sarah Mitchell is announcing some big project tonight. They say it's going to change the whole city. Sterling frowned, the name tickling something in his memory. Sarah Mitchell. Before Jerry could answer, the room lights dimmed slightly, and Mayor Roberts stepped up to the podium. His face was beaming with excitement as he adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, the mayor began, we are honored to have with us tonight someone who has dedicated her life to making our city better. Over the past 5 years, her foundation has provided college scholarships to over 1,000 underprivileged students, built 3 community centers, and funded countless educational programs. Judge Sterling pulled out his phone, already losing interest. Another wealthy donor looking for attention, he thought. Please welcome, the mayor continued, the CEO of the Mitchell Foundation for Community Development, and one of Time magazine's most influential people of the year, Ms. Sarah Mitchell. The room erupted in applause. Sterling glanced up casually, then froze. His phone slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. Walking to the podium was the same woman he had found just that morning. She wore the same blue blazer, but now she carried herself with an authority that filled the room. How had he missed it in his courtroom? Thank you, Mayor Roberts, Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. Today, I'm excited to announce that the Mitchell Foundation is committing $5 million to improve our city's infrastructure and educational facilities. Judge Sterling felt his face grow hot as she continued speaking. He remembered how he had dismissed her attempts to explain herself that morning, how he had talked down to her about teaching responsibility. Our first project, Sarah announced, will be a complete renovation of the county courthouse. She smiled, and for a brief moment, her eyes met Sterling's in the crowd. We believe justice should be accessible to everyone, and that starts with creating a welcoming environment where all people are treated with respect and dignity. The room burst into applause again. Sterling noticed several people wiping tears from their eyes. Next to him, Jerry was nodding enthusiastically. That woman is amazing, Jerry whispered. Did you know she turned down a partnership at Goldman Sachs to start her foundation? She uses her entire salary to fund scholarships for kids from low-income families. Sterling could barely hear him over the pounding in his ears. He watched as Sarah showed slides of the planned renovations, the same courthouse where he had treated her with such disrespect hours earlier. Each detail of her presentation revealed another layer of her accomplishments. Harvard Law School graduate, recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, author of 2 books on community development. When the presentation ended, people crowded around Sarah, eager to shake her hand and offer congratulations. Sterling sat in his chair, feeling smaller by the minute. He watched as she spoke with everyone who approached her, giving each person her full attention, the same attention he had denied her. Quite impressive, isn't she? Mayor Roberts had walked over to where Sterling sat. Sarah's foundation has done more for this city in 5 years than most people do in a lifetime, and you know what's really remarkable? Earlier today, she was telling me about some rude treatment she received in traffic court, but she still insisted on including the courthouse in her renovation plans. The mayor chuckled. That's just who she is, always taking the high road. Judge Sterling tugged at his collar, which suddenly felt too tight. Through the crowd, he caught another glimpse of Sarah Mitchell. She was smiling warmly at a young intern, showing the same dignity she had maintained in his courtroom despite his condescension. For the first time in his 20 years on the bench, Judge William Sterling felt the full weight of justice resting not on his shoulders, but on his conscience. Judge Sterling couldn't sleep that night. At 3 a.m., he sat in his home office, his laptop casting a blue glow across his tired face. The local news website filled his screen with headlines about Sarah Mitchell, each article revealing more about the woman he had so quickly judged. Local hero, Sarah Mitchell's journey from housing project to Harvard Law, read one headline. Sterling clicked it, his coffee growing cold beside him as he read. The article told a remarkable story. Sarah had grown up in Pine Grove, the city's poorest neighborhood. Her mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, while her father had been killed in a workplace accident when she was just 5. Despite these challenges, Sarah had earned straight A's throughout school, often studying by candlelight when their electricity was cut off. I remember those nights, Sarah was quoted in the article. But my mother always said, education is the one thing they can't take from you. Sterling scrolled through more articles. There was Sarah at age 17, accepting a full scholarship to Harvard. There she was again at 25, shocking everyone by turning down $1 million job offer to start her foundation with her savings on a small inheritance from her grandmother. His mouse hovered over a video link. Sarah Mitchell's inspiring speech at Children's Hospital opening. With shaking hands, he pressed play. The Sarah on his screen wore the same dignified expression she had shown in his courtroom, but now she stood before a crowd of hundreds. Behind her was a gleaming new children's hospital wing, funded largely by her foundation. "Every child deserves a chance," she said in the video, her voice firm but kind. "When I was 10, my best friend died because her family couldn't afford proper medical care. I promised myself that if I ever had the means, I would make sure no child in our city would face that same fate." Sterling minimized the video and opened another tab. A business magazine article detailed how Sarah had built her foundation from nothing. She had started by tutoring kids in Pine Grove, using her Harvard law degree to help their parents with legal issues. When word spread about her work, small donations started coming in. Those small donations grew into larger ones as wealthy donors saw the real change she was making. Ms. Mitchell sleeps on a fold-out couch in her office at least 3 nights a week, her assistant was quoted saying. She says she won't buy a bigger house until every homeless shelter in the city has enough beds. The judge's eyes burned as he read about the lives she had touched. There was the story of Marcus Thompson, a boy from Pine Grove who is now a medical student thanks to her scholarship program, and Maria Rodriguez, a single mother who now owned a successful bakery because of a small business loan from the Mitchell Foundation. His phone buzzed, a news alert. The city's largest paper had just published their morning edition online. Sarah Mitchell's face smiled from the front page, standing at the City Hall podium. The article mentioned her morning court appearance, describing how she had rushed to pay her fine before the development meeting. Even after receiving what witnesses described as dismissive treatment in traffic court, Ms. Mitchell maintained her commitment to including the courthouse in her renovation plans, the article read. "Every person deserves to be treated with dignity in our justice system," she stated when asked about the incident. "Sometimes the best response to unfair treatment is to work harder for positive change." Sterling closed his laptop, the room plunging into darkness. Through his office window, he could see the lights of the city he thought he knew so well. Somewhere out there, he realized, Sarah Mitchell was probably still working, still planning ways to make that city better, even for people who had wronged her. He thought about how she had stood in his courtroom, trying to explain herself. How many other Sarah Mitchells had he silenced over the years? How many stories had he refused to hear? The weight of these questions pressed against his chest as the first light of dawn began to creep over the city skyline. The next morning, Judge Sterling arrived at the courthouse 2 hours early. The building was quiet, with only the gentle hum of cleaning equipment in the distance. He sat in his chambers, surrounded by his law degrees and awards. But for the first time in years, these achievements felt hollow. On his desk sat a stack of DVDs, recordings of his past court sessions. He had requested them from the court clerk yesterday, earning a surprised look. Judges rarely reviewed their old cases unless there was an appeal. "Let's see who I really am," he muttered, sliding the first disc into his computer. The screen flickered to life, showing his courtroom from 3 months ago. He watched himself handle case after case, and slowly, a disturbing pattern emerged. When white defendants explained their situations, he listened patiently. When minorities spoke, he often cut them off. His hands trembled as he changed to another disc, then another. The evidence was undeniable. A white businessman got a warning for running a red light because he was rushing to an important meeting. The next day, a black teacher got a full fine for the same offense, despite explaining she was taking a sick student home. "Oh God," Sterling whispered, pushing back from his desk. His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized. A knock on his door startled him. It was Officer Rodriguez, the court officer who had been present during Sarah Mitchell's hearing. "Judge Sterling, are you okay?" Rodriguez asked, noticing the judge's pale face. "I saw your light on early." Sterling gestured to his computer screen. "I'm watching old cases. Rodriguez, be honest with me. Have you ever noticed me treating people differently?" Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, it's not my place to." "Please," Sterling interrupted. "I need to know." Rodriguez closed the door and sat down. "Yes," he said quietly. I've noticed. Many of us have, but judges. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Judges aren't easy to approach about such things. Sterling nodded slowly, remembering his own dismissive attitude whenever someone tried to suggest he might be biased. How many Sarah Mitchells have I hurt? He wondered aloud. Sir? People I judged wrongly. People whose stories I refused to hear. Sterling pointed to his screen. I just watched myself lecture a black woman about responsibility last week. She was trying to explain that she was speeding because her child was having an asthma attack. I fined her anyway. Rodriguez watched as the usually confident judge seemed to shrink in his chair. 20 years on this bench, Sterling continued, and I never once questioned my own judgment. I thought being tough but fair meant treating everyone the same, but I wasn't treating everyone the same, was I? Recognition is the first step, Rodriguez said gently. My wife teaches diversity training at the police academy. She always says that the hardest prejudices to fight are the ones we don't know we have. Sterling looked up. Does she? The training center? It's on Pine Grove Avenue, isn't it? Yes, actually. How did you know? Sarah Mitchell's foundation funds it, Sterling said quietly, along with dozen other programs I probably dismissed without a second thought. He stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the people already lining up outside the courthouse. How many of them would stand before him today? How many stories would they bring? For the first time in his career, he felt unprepared to take the bench. Rodriguez, he said, still staring out the window, could you help me find out if that woman with the asthmatic child paid her fine? Of course, Your Honor. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time I learned to listen. Sterling turned back to his desk, pulling out a legal pad. And maybe time to make some things right. As the morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, Judge William Sterling began to write. At the top of his pad, he wrote 2 words that would change everything. Action plan. Judge Sterling sat in the back row of the diversity training classroom, feeling strangely nervous without his black robe. The room was filled with police officers, teachers, and other city workers. He was the only judge present. Welcome everyone, said Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, Officer Rodriguez's wife. She smiled warmly at Sterling, who had called her personally to enroll in the course. Today, we're going to discuss unconscious bias and how it affects our daily decisions. As Dr. Rodriguez began her presentation, Sterling noticed a familiar logo on the training materials, the Mitchell Foundation. Of course, he thought. Sarah Mitchell's influence seemed to touch everything positive in the city. Let's start with a simple exercise, Dr. Rodriguez announced. Think about the last time you made a quick judgment about someone that turned out to be completely wrong. Sterling's mind immediately went to that morning in his courtroom. His cheeks burned as other participants shared their stories. A police officer talked about assuming a well-dressed man was lost in a poor neighborhood, only to learn he lived there and ran a youth center. A teacher admitted thinking a quiet student was unintelligent before discovering she was actually a child genius who spoke 4 languages. During the lunch break, Sterling found himself sitting with a young police rookie named James. I've never seen a judge in these training sessions before, James said, unwrapping his sandwich. What made you come? Sterling stirred his coffee slowly. Let's just say I recently had a wake-up call. Found out I wasn't as fair and impartial as I thought I was. Must be hard, James replied. I mean, you guys are supposed to be perfect, right? That's part of the problem, Sterling said. We start believing we're above making mistakes, but sometimes the people we judge so quickly have more wisdom than we do. After lunch, Dr. Rodriguez handed out statistics about bias in the justice system. Sterling's eyes widened as he read. Black defendants received higher fines for the same offenses. Their explanations were more likely to be interrupted. Even their court-appointed lawyers spent less time preparing their cases. This is happening in my courtroom, he whispered to himself, taking careful notes. During the afternoon session, they watched videos of real court cases. Sterling recognized his own behaviors in other judges, the dismissive tone, the quick judgments, the interrupted explanations. Each example felt like a mirror being held up to his face. At the end of the day, as others were leaving, Sterling approached Dr. Rodriguez. This training, he said, it's really opened my eyes. But one day isn't enough, is it? She shook her head. It's just the beginning. Real change takes time and constant effort. Could you? He hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. Could you help me design a training program specifically for judges? Something that addresses the unique challenges we face. Dr. Rodriguez's eyes lit up. Actually, the Mitchell Foundation has been trying to implement judicial bias training for years, but we've never had a judge willing to champion the cause. Well, now you do, Sterling said firmly, and I think I know exactly how to start. That evening, Sterling stayed late at the courthouse again, but this time he wasn't watching old videos. Instead, he was writing emails to every judge in the district, sharing his experience and inviting them to join him in the training program. To his surprise, responses started coming in immediately. Some were defensive, but others showed interest. Judge Thompson, his friend from the City Hall meeting, wrote back, "If you think this is important, Bill, I'm in. Maybe it's time we all looked in the mirror." Sterling smiled as he read the responses. Then he opened a new email and began to type. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, I believe we need to talk. Not about traffic violations, but about making real changes in our justice system. Your foundation has been doing incredible work that I've been too blind to see. I have a proposal I'd like to discuss with you." His finger hovered over the send button. Was he ready for this conversation? Then he remembered Sarah's dignity in his courtroom, her grace at the City Hall meeting. If she could maintain her composure in the face of injustice, he could find the courage to face his own mistakes. He clicked send. Judge Sterling stood in front of the Mitchell Foundation building, his heart pounding. The modern glass structure reflected the morning sun, making it shine like a beacon in the city center. He checked his watch, 9:55 a.m. His meeting with Sarah Mitchell was scheduled for 10 o'clock. This time he wouldn't be late. This time he would listen. The security guard smiled as he approached. "Judge Sterling, Miss Mitchell is expecting you, 15th floor." The elevator ride felt longer than usual. Sterling clutched his folder, containing printouts of his court records and his plans for judicial reform. His palms were sweaty, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his first day as a judge 20 years ago. Sarah's assistant greeted him warmly. "Please go right in, Judge Sterling. Would you like some water?" He nodded gratefully, his throat suddenly dry. Then he stepped into Sarah Mitchell's office and stopped in surprise. Instead of the grand executive office he had expected, the room was simple and practical. A fold-out couch sat in one corner, confirming the stories about her late-night work sessions. The walls were covered with children's drawings and thank-you letters. Sarah stood up from behind her desk, wearing the same blue blazer from their first encounter. "Judge Sterling," she said, extending her hand. "Please have a seat." He shook her hand, noticing how she met his eyes without a trace of anger or resentment. They sat down, and for a moment, neither spoke. "Miss Mitchell," Sterling began, his voice slightly shaky. "First, I need to apologize. My behavior in that courtroom was—" "Judge Sterling," Sarah interrupted gently, "before you continue, I want to show you something." She opened a drawer and pulled out an old, worn-out traffic ticket. 20 years ago, when I was a freshman at Harvard, I got this ticket. The judge wouldn't listen to my explanation about rushing to my mother's hospital bedside. He treated me like I was nothing. Sterling felt his chest tighten as she continued. "That day, I promised myself that if I ever had the power to change things, I would. Not out of anger or revenge, but because everyone deserves to be heard." She smiled. "Even judges who sometimes forget to listen." "You're very generous," Sterling said quietly. "But I've been watching my old court sessions. The way I treated you wasn't an isolated incident. I've been carrying these biases for years without even realizing it." Sarah nodded. "Awareness is the first step. What matters now is what you do with that awareness." Sterling opened his folder with trembling hands. "I've enrolled in diversity training. I'm working with Dr. Rodriguez to develop a program specifically for judges, but I need your help." He spread out his plans on her desk. "These are proposals for changing how our courts handle cases, required bias training for all judges, a new system for reviewing judicial conduct, community feedback sessions." He paused. "But it won't work without someone who truly understands both sides of the bench." Sarah studied the papers carefully. "You put a lot of thought into this." "I have, but I'm just one judge. Your foundation has the resources and the trust of the community. Together, we might actually be able to make real change." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then stood up and walked to her window. You know, Judge Sterling, when I left your courtroom that day, I wasn't angry. I was sad. Sad because I saw a man who had the power to make a difference but couldn't see past his own prejudices. She turned back to face him. But now I see something different. I see someone willing to learn and change. That's rare, especially in positions of power. Sterling held his breath as she walked back to her desk. Well, she said, a small smile playing at her lips, where shall we begin? For the first time since entering her office, Sterling felt his shoulders relax. They spent the next hour talking about their experiences from opposite sides of the justice system. He shared stories of his own journey from a poor white neighborhood to law school. She told him about the challenges she still faced, even as a successful foundation leader. As their meeting ended, Sarah walked him to the door. Judge Sterling? He turned. Yes. Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our most important work. Sterling nodded, understanding the weight of her words. As he left the building, he realized this wasn't just about making amends to one person. It was about changing an entire system, one courtroom at a time. 3 months after his meeting with Sarah Mitchell, Judge Sterling's courtroom looked very different. Gone was the rushed atmosphere of quick judgments. Instead, a new sign hung on the wall. Every story deserves to be heard. It was Monday morning, and a young Hispanic woman stood before him, nervously explaining her situation in broken English. Señor Judge, I was speeding because my daughter. She struggled with the words. Mrs. Ramirez, Sterling said gently, would you be more comfortable with a court translator? Her eyes widened in surprise. The old Judge Sterling would have simply issued a fine and moved on, but that man was gone. Yes, please, she whispered. Officer Rodriguez, who had watched Sterling's transformation over the past months, smiled as he called for the translator. This was just one of many changes. The judge now arrived early each day to review cases thoroughly. He had installed a suggestion box outside his courtroom and actually read every comment. After Mrs. Ramirez's case was properly heard, revealing that she had been rushing her daughter to a crucial college scholarship interview, Sterling reduced her fine and connected her with one of Sarah Mitchell's educational programs. During lunch, Sterling met with a group of young judges he was mentoring. They gathered in his chambers, sharing experiences from their morning sessions. I caught myself today, Judge Thompson's son, a newly appointed judge, admitted. I was about to dismiss an elderly black man's explanation, then I remembered our training. Turns out he had proof of everything he was saying. The old me would have missed that. Sterling nodded, remembering his own journey. The Judicial Bias Training Program, developed with Sarah's foundation, was now mandatory for all judges in the district. Some had resisted at first, but the results were undeniable. Complaint rates had dropped by 40%. Community trust was growing. The key, Sterling told them, is to question our first impressions. Every time I think I know exactly what's happening in a case, I force myself to ask one more question. That afternoon, he had a different kind of session. The courthouse conference room was filled with people he had wrongly judged over the years. With Sarah's help, he had tracked down many of them, offering not just apologies but practical help. The woman with the asthmatic child was there. Sterling had refunded her fine and helped her connect with a medical assistance program. So was the teacher he had fined unfairly. She now ran a legal education program in her school, funded jointly by the court and the Mitchell Foundation. Your Honor, one man spoke up. When you called to apologize, I thought it was a joke. Judges don't do that. But you didn't just say sorry, you actually made changes. Sterling looked around the room, seeing heads nodding in agreement. I had help, he said, glancing at Sarah, who sat quietly in the corner observing. Sometimes we need someone to hold up a mirror and make us really look at ourselves. Later that evening, as the sun set over the courthouse, Sterling reviewed his notes from the day. His desk, once covered in simple case files, now held community feedback reports, training materials, and program proposals. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Rodriguez. Just wanted to say, Judge. Rodriguez smiled. My wife says her judicial training classes are now full. Every single judge in the district has signed up for the advanced course. Sterling leaned back in his chair, remembering the arrogant man he had been just a few months ago. You know, Rodriguez, I used to think justice was about being tough. Now I understand it's about being fair, truly fair, not just saying we are. Big difference, Rodriguez agreed. The biggest, Sterling replied, picking up a new case file for tomorrow. And we're just getting started. As he prepared to leave for the day, Sterling paused to straighten the new sign on his wall. Below, every story deserves to be heard. Someone had added a smaller line. Change begins with listening. He smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new stories, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that even the most deeply rooted prejudices could be overcome. One case, one person, one moment of understanding at a time. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in traffic court. The grand ballroom of the city convention center was filled with judges, lawyers, community leaders, and activists from across the country. They had come to witness something unprecedented, the launch of the National Judicial Fairness Initiative. Judge William Sterling stood backstage, adjusting his tie nervously. The past year had transformed not just his courtroom, but courts across the entire state. Now, they were taking the program nationwide. Ready? Sarah Mitchell appeared beside him, looking elegant in a navy blue suit. There are judges here from 30 different states. Sterling nodded, looking out at the crowd. A year ago, I wouldn't have believed this was possible. Sometimes, Sarah smiled, our biggest mistakes lead to our greatest achievements. The mayor stepped up to the podium, his voice filling the room. Ladies and gentlemen, 1 year ago, an incident in our traffic court could have ended in bitterness. Instead, it sparked a revolution in our justice system. The large screen behind him showed statistics. Complaint rates down by 60%, community trust levels up by 70%, racial disparities in fines and sentencing reduced dramatically. Please welcome, the mayor announced, the co-creators of the National Judicial Fairness Initiative, the Honorable Judge William Sterling and Ms. Sarah Mitchell. The applause was thunderous as they walked onto the stage together. Sterling looked out at the faces in the crowd. He saw Officer Rodriguez and his wife Dr. Rodriguez, who now ran judicial training programs in 3 states. He saw Mrs. Ramirez, the Spanish-speaking mother who had become a court translator herself. Even his old friend Judge Thompson was there, now a vocal advocate for judicial reform. Sarah spoke first, her voice clear and strong. Change doesn't always come from grand plans. Sometimes it comes from simple moments of truth, from having the courage to admit we were wrong and the determination to do better. Sterling stepped up next. A year ago, I was a judge who thought he knew everything about justice. Then I learned my most important lesson from someone I had wrongly judged. He turned to Sarah. She taught me that true justice begins with listening. Together, they unveiled their new program. Every courthouse would have mandatory bias training. Community feedback panels would review judicial conduct. A special fund would help low-income defendants access legal resources. The Mitchell Foundation would provide support, while experienced judges would serve as mentors. After the presentation, a young black judge from Georgia approached Sterling. Your story gives me hope, she said. But weren't you afraid of admitting your mistakes so publicly? Sterling thought for a moment. The shame isn't in admitting our mistakes, he replied. The shame is in refusing to learn from them. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Sterling found himself back in his courtroom. The renovation was complete, but he had kept the simple sign. Every story deserves to be heard. Sarah joined him there. Quite a journey from that traffic ticket, she said, sitting in the witness chair. You know, Sterling replied, I keep wondering why you didn't expose me that day. You could have embarrassed me publicly, used your influence to have me removed. Sarah looked around the courtroom thoughtfully, because change that comes from shame rarely lasts, but change that comes from understanding, that can transform not just one person, but an entire system. As if to prove her point, voices drifted in from the hallway. The evening training session was starting. Through the door, they could see judges, both young and old, arriving with notebooks in hand, ready to learn. We're not finished, are we? Sterling asked. No, Sarah smiled. We're just beginning. There are more stories to hear, more changes to make. Then let's get to work, Sterling said, standing up. As they walked out together, they passed the wall where Sterling's awards used to hang. Now it displayed something different. Photographs of community meetings, training sessions, and people whose lives had been touched by their program. At the center was a simple framed quote: "Justice is not just about being right, it's about being willing to learn when we are wrong." The courthouse lights dimmed as they left, but its spirit burned brighter than ever, a beacon of hope for a justice system where every story truly deserved to be heard.